Okay, everyone. Hi, everyone, and welcome to another colloquium hosted by the Psychology Department at Stellenbosch University. And today I'm really excited to introduce my colleagues who will be speaking, and they are Mariam, Salie and Megan Snow. And today they're going to be speaking about their reflections on community service in the Department of Correctional Services. If you haven't yet, I highly recommend that you read the article called Add to Cart, Prison-Based Community Services for Psychologists in SA and the Comfort of Online Shopping. And this has been published in the Journal of Psychodynamic Practice. So before I hand over to Mariam and Megan, I just want to tell you a little bit about them. Both of them are lecturers in our department. They are clinical psychologists, early career academics, and they are PhD candidates. Mariam has an interest in Muslim mental health, culture and mental health, and CBT. And with all of this, she's also a mom of 4, so she juggles quite a bit. Megan, on the other hand, is interested in student mental health, health psychology, and developmental psychology. She's a runner and enjoys the outdoors and has other creative ways of managing her stress. So a few household issues before we get started. Please keep your mics and your cameras off while they are presenting. If you have a question, you can add it into the chat and we will read it to them afterwards and they'll answer. If you want to ask them again yourself afterwards, just put your hand up after they finish their presentation and we'll ask you to ask your question. So other than that, without any further ado, Megan and Mariam, over to you.
Thank you so much, Rizwana, and hello to everybody.
Hello.
I see some of my classmates are here. It's good to have them in the house. I'm just going to switch our camera off because we've got a little presentation, and Megan will start for us.
Okay, so good afternoon, and thank you to everyone who's joined our presentation today, and obviously especially to the organizers of the colloquium for inviting us and giving us this opportunity to share our thoughts and reflections here today. Before I start, I think it's important for me to highlight from the start that obviously everything that we're sharing here today is really based on mine and Mariam's subjective experiences and opinions and reflections of our time where we worked or we did time at DCS. And that the presentation today might at times include information of a sensitive or disturbing nature. However, it's important for us, and it's important for us also to say that from the start, we will not share any explicit content pertaining to case material so that we at all times can protect the identities and the confidentiality of the clients that we did work with during our time at DCS. So just a quick outline of what we're going to cover today during our presentation. I will start by giving a bit of an introduction around how one does become a clinical psychologist in the South African context, for those who don't know, and then also where community service fits into this process. And then we'll kind of shift our talk more toward our actual experiences with working within the correctional services, and then further explore that in terms of the strategies and the defenses that we used during our time there. In what we realized in reflecting was a difficult year, but extremely meaningful for the both of us. We'll then conclude our talk by reflecting on ideas and thoughts that have maybe lingered with us after our community service year, and then also critically kind of ask the question around whether there is actually a place for psychology in DCS and what that actually might look like or need to look like for things to kind of feel like they're a better match or fit for those moving into that space. So I'll just move on to the process. So to be able to become a clinical psychologist in South Africa, you're required to complete 2 or 3 years of training, which is then followed by a community service year and then a board exam before you can register as an independent practitioner. The first year of your training, which is commonly known as the M1 year, takes place at the university and has a large academic component and a smaller component of practical work with clients. You then move on to the internship, which is usually completed at a tertiary hospital, where the focus shifts slightly away from the heavy academic load to more toward cases and caseloads, and also then an increased exposure to therapeutic clients. So both Mariam and myself, we completed our master's year at Stellenbosch. I completed my internship at Lentegeur Psychiatric Hospital, and Mariam did hers with 2 Military Hospital. And I think a key feature of both the M1 and the internship year was really what stands out to us is that real felt sense of support, very clear guidance and extensive clinical supervision in all the spaces, really geared toward supporting you as a training clinical psychologist, and then obviously also the clients seeking to use that services. The internship in the M1 is really a space where those employed by it or within it are mostly like-minded, and that I think also further enhances or did enhance that feeling of really feeling held by the system, and knowing that support can be and would be offered in the form of supervision, teaching, or the multidisciplinary teams at the hospitals, each able to offer their kind of area of expertise. And that really helped as a training psychologist in that feeling of being supported and supervised with every step within your training. The next step, however, is the community service year after you've obviously completed the master's and internship. And the community service year has been compulsory for clinical psychologists since 2002. And the option for completing community service within the Department of Correctional Services became an option since 2005. And this was as a result, the decision was made because of the shortage of psychologists within the Department of Correctional Services. So I mean, when you think of any interns or our own experiences, that even applying for your community service year is quite the stressful one. And simply because when you choose, I think you have to choose about 5 options, all from within different provinces. And obviously all of us want to stay close to home. And unfortunately, positions in the Cape or the Western Cape even are quite limited. So it often means that as interns applying for ComServe, we don't necessarily get your preferred post. And then you often sent away to other provinces to complete your community service away from home. I mean, so with that being said, Mariam and myself both applied to complete our community service year within the Department of Correctional Services, or DCS, as we'll refer to it. Although I'll admit that DCS was not necessarily my first choice. I asked Mariam what was her motivation for applying to DCS, and she said it was very much based on the desire to gain experience in forensic work, which had not been included in her internship. And if I were to be honest, my motivation to applying to DCS was really just strategic. I was told that applying to DCS will increase your chances of being closer to home. So that's what I did. I applied to DCS and with the hope that I would stay close to home. Mariam then ended up when we applied, Mariam ended up at the Polsmoor Correctional Facility, where she worked in the Medium B Male Center, and I ended up at Voorberg, which is about 90 minutes outside of Cape Town in a very small town called Porterville. So, I mean, although Mariam and I completed our ComServes at different facilities, and also, let me note, in different years, me in 2015 and her in 2017, we were surprised when we started having conversations about our time within DCS and reflecting on that, and realized how much of our feelings and experiences were actually shared. I think what emerged then, the first point that really stood out to the both of us was the big jump from the masters to the internship, masters and internship, to the ComServe. So the masters and internship, as I said, was lots of guidance, lots of supervision, lots of support. And then you get to ComServe in DCS and one ends up feeling quite isolated. I think to a large degree, we felt like we had moved from warm spaces where you were observed with the intention of providing you with support to a space in DCS where you were also observed and watched, but honestly, more from a place of scrutiny and mistrust you were watched. And really in reflecting on this, I think it's also interesting that we are now around 5 years post community service, and only now really have developed the capacity to reflect on this experience in a meaningful way. And we've done this through writing 2 published articles on our experiences. And yeah, I'd like to thank Leslie, who was involved in the writing and really guided us with both of these written articles. The first was Mariam's article on the struggles to be therapeutic. And the second article was a co-authored article on online shopping as a coping strategy, which I will talk a little bit about later. I really think talking and writing about our shared experiences, and even this talk today, has been a great source of validation of the experiences that we had during our DCS time. Irvin Yalom, who's an American psychiatrist, speaks about this idea of universality that really facilitates and is therapeutic within the group process. And this is really when someone obviously shares their experiences and then through other group members hearing that sense of being alone, where you almost felt like there was just an I. Others kind of respond to you and say, I've also felt that. So the I becomes a we, and that shared feeling and having that ability to realize that you're not alone and you're not isolated, but instead that you feel connected and validated in recognizing that others around you have perhaps struggled with the same thing. So writing and talking about it has helped us reflect and really left us with a greater feeling of containment and that idea of universality that he speaks about. But I guess as much as this process has been helpful to us personally, we really felt in terms of writing and even having this talk today, that we hoped others would find it helpful, those who have maybe been through the system or process already, but especially for those kind of making their way through this training, maybe considering whether DCS might be an option for ComServe. We're hoping that today's talk will be an opportunity for them to hear some of our thoughts and then maybe even gain greater insight into whether they're really wanting to consider DCS as an option for their ComServe placements. So I mean, that's just broadly speaking an introduction of how we kind of ended up at DCS. So I'm going to hand over to Mariam, who will more specifically now kind of speak about the various factors which felt pertinent and relevant to us in our experiences at DCS.
Thank you, Megan. I just want to, before I begin, I also just want to acknowledge that one of the other authors from the Add to Cart article is attending this meeting, Kriska Marquardt. So it was co-authored by myself, Megan, Kriska, another colleague, Henri, and of course Leslie. And we really do appreciate all the input that Leslie's given in both of these publications. I think he also provided some of the containment that Megan spoke about. So I've titled the experience of being a clinical psychologist in DCS as the good, the bad, and the ugly, because I think it's a very accurate description of what the experience was like. And the good part of it was more, I think, the skills that we felt that we had acquired working in DCS and some of the experiences. And one of the first was the independence. So as Megan mentioned, during your internship year and during your M1 year, there's quite a bit of support in terms of supervision. And then in DCS, and again, depending on where you are, there's no supervision. So where I was working, where Megan was working, we were the only psychologists in those centers, which meant that we kind of had to manage ourselves. And although where I worked at Paulsmoor, I had access to supervision, but I could request it. It did help us with that independence of being able to work on treatment plans and learning how to manage on your own. Because of course, after community service, the next step was to work as an independent practitioner. And then we both felt that we could relate to the offenders, the population that we worked with. So at both of the prisons that we were at, once again, we were from a similar population group, and this gave us a kind of an in. This may have been different for other psychologists working at other prisons, but we were able to relate to our clients' languages. We were able to relate to the color of their skin, and we were essentially treated as one of them. And this really helped with us settling into that role. But at the same time, we were very aware of the different histories that we had. Although we were from the same group, we had different histories. Then the other thing I think which stood out for us was, empathy is a skill that all clinical psychologists, we work with being empathic towards our clients. And it's a very difficult thing to do in DCS because you're working with different offenders who committed different kinds of crimes, and there are different kinds of people. But we were able to sit with that and be able to be empathic with all of the clients that we worked with. And I think this was another skill that we developed. Then I don't know how many would understand the term steekgevriet. It's an Afrikaans term, and sometimes Afrikaans just has a very good way of explaining something. And what it means is that when you put on you present yourself in this assertive manner or in a strong, sometimes stubborn manner, regardless of how you're feeling internally. And I think this is something that we had to do quite often because we had to manage our boundaries in a system that was often boundaryless, and we had to protect ourselves in different ways. So we developed a sense of being assertive when we needed to, both with offenders and also with the staff and the wardens of DCS. I think also one of the things that I found that I was pleased about was the fact that there was clinical psychologists in DCS, the fact that offenders actually had access to this kind of service. And I was very aware of the fact that they had access to a service that most South Africans actually do not have access to. And they could be referred to us through a case manager, through the parole board, but they also had the prerogative of actually requesting psychological services. And it was with those clients, those offenders who actually sought out the service, that we had quite meaningful processes with. Then we come to the middle circle, which is the bad. So there was this expected role from us as psychologists, and I think it stemmed from a lack of understanding about psychology and what it was and what it meant and the kind of service that we were meant to mete out. But we became we were brought into the admin role. So as I mentioned, Megan and I were both the only psychologists at the center that we were at, the prison center we were at, which meant that we were also considered a manager for psychology, for psychological services, which meant that we had to be part of the running of the center itself. So whenever there were management meetings, we had to attend those meetings and we had to give input on the running of the center, which was not necessarily related to our work. And this also took us away from time that we had available to actually work with clients. And of course, just to give you a little bit of insight, there are only certain times of the day that you can work with clients because they get locked up at a certain time, and then they're locked up until the following morning. So the time period that we had, so although we worked until let's say from 7 until 3, the time period that you had available was probably from about 9 to 1. To work with offenders and to see them. So if we had any kind of management meetings or things like that, it meant it took away from the time that we actually had available to our clients. The other thing was that, again, because of the lack of understanding of psychology and what that meant, we found we had the experience that we were almost seen as, and I'm going to use the term wastebasket because we were trying to think what other word we can use, but when wardens didn't know what to do with an offender, or they didn't understand what was happening with the offender, they would just bring it to us, and we needed to sort it out. And it wasn't where they actually had a discussion, where there was a consultation and thinking together about what could possibly be done to help this offender. It was more that they would just bring the offender to us and say, this is the problem. Please, can you sort it out? So even the whole referral system was not in line with how we would normally work. I must also add that in the center, again, where I worked with the social workers who were also at Medium B, and I think a lot of the containment that I did get was from the social workers that I worked with, and even just an orientation to how things work in prison. I got it from the social workers. So there were opportunities where I felt I was part of a multidisciplinary team, where we were working together on cases, but for a large part of the experience, you were basically on your own. And then also psychology is seen to be part of the the rehabilitation process of offenders. And I think this is one of the biggest struggles I had, because often I would question the ethics around this, because we were seen to be part of this rehabilitation process, but the process was not working at all. And the way in which we had to make contact with offenders, and the statistics we needed to that we needed to meet, it didn't work out. And so often we were left questioning the ethics around this whole rehabilitation process, and us being seen as a part of it, but it not actually working out in that way. We also had the responsibility of conducting risk assessments. And again, not all psychologists, community service psychologists do risk assessments. But for those of us who had to do it, a risk assessment is basically where you have to do an assessment on an offender who received a life sentence, so we call them lifers. After 25 years, they are up for parole, and then they have to go through an assessment process with a psychologist, a social worker, and the parole board. But our report is given to the minister in order to determine whether the offender can be released on parole or not. We are allowed to make recommendations in this assessment, but often the assessments were done over a short period of time. And so the responsibility of doing this kind of assessment in a limited time frame, but that had a bearing on whether this offender would be released or not, it felt like a responsibility, an overwhelming responsibility actually, for us to hold as community service psychologists. Then just in terms of Megan mentioned that we were at different places, but we felt quite isolated because, again, the limited supervision that we spoke about. So it meant that we didn't have that space to be held and be contained, and which made it difficult for us in turn to create that space for our clients because, with therapy, you're providing a safe and secure space, and it was very difficult to do that without us having access to that kind of space as well. So there was limited supervision, although, like I said, I was able to, I befriended the colleague who was at the prison next door, and so often when I felt like I really needed to be debriefed or to have supervision on a particular case, I would request, from her. We met once a month with the psychologist from the Western Cape, but it was more as a continuous professional development space rather than a supervision space. Although at some point during the year, one of the senior psychologists offered to keep time available if there were any cases that we would like to bring to that space and get input on. But there was nothing that was where it was set out as this, was the supervision space. I think that part of the isolation also was, just being in the prison space because it was very difficult to get out of the prison as much as, so I don't know if anyone has been to Paulsma. I'm going to use Paulsma as an example. So when you come through the main gates, there are 5 different prisons on Paulsma, and Medium B is one of them. So you're coming firstly through the main gate, and then when you get to Medium B, there's an outside gate you need to get through, and then there's about 3 gates you have to get through in order to get to our offices. So our offices were located inside the prison, close to the cells. And so the physical barrier of the prison, making it difficult to leave if you need a breather or you just need to get out of there, it was difficult. So again, it was part of that isolation. And one of the things that you experience, working with the offending population is that sometimes it's petty crime. But often there were cases that we worked on where it was heinous crimes, and that vicarious traumatization from listening to the details of these crimes. There was no consideration for that. There was no, like I said, you had to kind of seek out the debriefing or supervision if you knew that you were going to be working on that kind of a case, but there wasn't actually anything set up for that. And then the struggle to be therapeutic. So the first article that I wrote, which was a reflection on the general experience, was around this theme of struggling to be therapeutic, providing a safe and secure space for clients, trying to work from all of us, we are familiar with Rogers and being empathic and being genuine, but having to work in a system that was quite the opposite of that, because how we treated the offenders in the room was very different to how they were treated right outside of our door, which was basically like animals. And then, of course, the physical setting of the room, it was dull, it was cold, it was unwelcome, it was noisy, it was smelly, and I was pregnant during my community service year, and I can tell you that it was not very pleasant smells. We were taught to set up the room, to put our chair across the chairs from our clients and to make sure that our chair is close to the door. But for some reason, and I have no idea how this happened, and again, Megan and I found that we ended up doing the same thing where we moved behind the desk. Now, of course, this is not therapeutic to be behind a desk and and then the client on the other side of the desk. And I have no idea what the desk was supposed to do to protect me, but at the time, it just felt like a safety net. Being able to be behind the desk and not directly opposite the offender. So the therapeutic space in prison itself is not a traditional one, because from the onset there's limited confidentiality because it being a prison. So you go into the process already compromised. And of course, there's this audit culture where we needed to meet certain statistics. We needed to see a certain amount of clients for the month. And so even having to work in that system was difficult to create a therapeutic space. But one of the biggest things was trying to be present while trying to be safe at the same time. So there was this need to be present and create the space as best we could. But at the same time, we were quite vigilant about the fact that we were in the space that was completely unsafe. So it was difficult to, and there was a few examples that we have where things escalated, with an offender. And we both had experiences where we became less therapeutic in that moment and almost distracted because we were trying to work on an escape route. If anything should happen, how were we going to get out of this room? And I'm not sure how Megan's room was set up, but my desk was at the back of the room against the window. So I would need to come past the offender in order to get out of the room. So I as he was talking, I was actually just trying to think, how am I going to get out of here if anything happens? Because I started feeling quite anxious in his presence. And there were many experiences like that, where we found that we were struggling to be therapeutic in that moment because we were so hyper vigilant. And it's very different to, we generally do observe our clients, but that hyper vigilance, it's a different kind of observation. It's really one where the focus is on trying to make sure that we were safe in that moment. We were also treated like outcasts in the system, and I suppose one of it was because we treated the offenders differently than the staff did. So it was almost like, inside the room, humane kind of treatment, outside of the room, inhumane treatment. And often we had lack of cooperation from staff. We treated offenders with care. So, it was apparent that we operated differently than the system itself. We also had to go through searches whenever we entered the prison. We weren't allowed to take our phones in. Megan actually had an experience where her phone was confiscated because, like many of us, we snuck our phones in. I think in the first 2 months, I left my phone outside, but because I was pregnant and I didn't have access to an outgoing line in my office, I decided to start taking my phone in and just keeping it on silent. So many of us resort to those kind of, just sneaking things in order to be able to function in that space. And then because I was pregnant, I had a few concessions, which included then being able to bring my phone in and being able to bring a bag in, because you weren't able to take a bag in as well. And again, even that made me think about how the system is set up in that some wardens, there's obviously a lot of corruption in prison as well. And so there's a lot of favoring between wardens and the offenders. And so it was always a two-way relationship. And so with me getting these concessions, I was often called upon by the head of the center who gave me these concessions to give input on admin matters. And again, which was not part of my role there. But this also, just further alienated myself from the staff. Then there was this culture of toxic masculinity in the system, and it's very clear, and even if you didn't experience it yourself, it was very clear how women were treated in the prison. There was unwanted advances from both offenders and wardens. You could see some of the sexism in the way that the women were treated in general. And sexual harassment was almost seen as a norm. So unwanted hugs and sexual advances, there was no issue with it. And coming in there, if you had any different way of looking at these things, you were obviously again the outcast. But I think the main thing is the lack of understanding of psychology, and this is something that ran through. One of the offenders said to me one day, he said, the only difference between the criminals and the wardens is the color of the uniform. And I found that so interesting. And I suppose it's because of the corruption, the amount of corruption that happens inside the prison. So there's no clear demarcation of who's who except for the color. So the orange separating the ones that's wearing the brown uniform. Because of a lot of offenders, they in prison because of assault or committing certain crimes, but the wardens were guilty of the same thing, being in that space and still doing the same thing, yet they were not behind bars. And all of this, this whole experience, had created this fragility and instability in the process, a process that usually functions on, creating a stable, secure, and safe space. It was difficult to do this because there was constant movement, constant change. You had a process with a client, and after 3 sessions, you have them called and they tell you no, but the prisoner was moved. So there was this constant change and constant movement which undermined our processes. And I had a very good relationship with the head of center that I was at, because he actually started the same time than I did. And when I needed an offender to remain in the prison to complete his process, I would speak to him and he would arrange for it. But this was not always the case. They would just be moved and you wouldn't be told about it. You would call for the prisoner and they would say nobody's gone. So there was just, it was so, the whole system was so unstable. It was very difficult to actually, to function in a stable space. I'll now hand back over to Megan, who will speak a bit about the strategies that we used.
Thanks so much, Mariam. I think what's very clear as you were speaking about the experiences, as much there were definitely elements that was good and there was meaningful work that was done. I think to a large extent what we've both been left with is this overwhelming kind of how difficult it has been to sit with the overwhelming kind of struggles that really lingered as part of our experiences there. And obviously, naturally, then when you find yourself in a particular scenario or setting that is really difficult and difficult. Our time in DCS really pose difficulties and struggles on a daily basis. One's kind of coping strategies become, I think in some ways, certain of them really heightened, but maybe most importantly, really important to be able to kind of cope with the reality of what needed to be done and where we needed to go every day. So in some of our conversation, we realized that our coping strategies could be kind of divided into what we term more adaptive strategies, and then maybe more the more maladaptive strategies. Also, we had a bit of a chuckle at how long our maladaptive strategies list ended up, or whether we want to even call them maladaptive as the defenses that we utilized on the daily basis, really to kind of help us move in a space that was really difficult. So I'll start with the adaptive strategies. The first being supervision and therapy, and Mariam kind of mentioned that a little bit. And I mean, up until kind of moving into ComServe, as I said, supervision was an integral part of training up until then. And so it became important, I think, especially in the isolated feeling that we felt within DCS, that supervision became especially important, whether it be the in-house supervision or that Mariam mentioned, that she'd sometimes go to the prison next door to kind of debrief with the colleague. Or what I ended up doing was seeking outside supervision with, interestingly, a supervisor who I had actually known. And I think part of that was obviously to be able to process and work through kind of therapeutically what was happening with clients, with someone who is able to provide that clinical supervision. But mine was also going back to a supervisor who I'd known, and I think to a large extent now it was more around also seeking the comfort of the familiar. I mean, an add-on to that is the therapy space, which then moves a little bit away from the processing of work and client therapies, but more to one's own personal processing. So those two containing spaces, I think, became really important for us to use. As Rizwan, I think, mentioned at the start, I'm a runner. I don't run so much now that it's so cold, but in reflecting on it now, I don't think I've ever run so much and so religiously and actually enjoyed my running as much as I did during my community service here. I don't know if it was the fresh air of Portable or the beautiful mountains as kind of aesthetically pleasing. But every morning, I think being able to go out for that run, and I think it was a combination of being able to breathe in the fresh air, where in prison it almost feels quite stifling, like one cannot breathe, not only because sometimes it just really smells really bad. So there was something about my morning run and being able to kind of breathe in that fresh air. But even then, I think there was something about being able to, every night I realized that I'd become quite paranoid around making sure that I locked up the house properly because I was living alone. So the paranoia around safety, but something so liberating every morning of being able to unlock and leave and go out for that run was definitely something that I've recognized was a very important strategy for me to be able to kind of muster up the energy to start my day and to go into prison a bit later. The other thing is this heightened need for control, and I think that played out in different spaces, whether it be kind of the, just planning of certain things. There was really an increased need for predictability and control, and I think that in reflecting on it was largely due to a sense of really feeling powerless and as if things were out of our control when kind of moving into the prison spaces. Mariam said something simple as having something on your schedule where you intend to see a particular client that you might have now established a good kind of therapeutic process, only to find out that they've left. Which really heightens one's sense of the system kind of working, I feel almost at some points against you, that the need for control just became so important. And then when things get really difficult, we're always preaching this importance of self-care. And the smoothie, Maria mentioned that every morning before work, and she would stop at, I think it's Kauai, Vida, and get herself a smoothie. And maybe to some degree also that was that need for that self-care, for that some kind of treat to almost reward yourself, even though it is at the start of the day. Maybe it was more reward of the day before, but being able to kind of reward yourself for actually deep down what was really a difficult and trying year for a variety of reasons. So I mean, those just maybe there were other adaptive strategies that we haven't necessarily thought about, but those were the ones that we've just highlighted here today. On the other hand, though, we recognize that there were maladaptive strategies or defenses that we did use. Maybe I'll start with the smoothie again. So as much as the smoothie was adaptive in a way of self-care and kind of treating herself, Mariam also mentioned that because she stopped every morning at the Vida, it meant that she arrived late to work. Now, within a prison system, which we every day experience to be quite rigid and rule-bound and really frustratingly so, in reflecting on the tardiness that stopping for the smoothie did result in was almost perhaps in some ways a passive pushback against the system, which felt really stifling. So that was the smoothie. I think to a large degree in our conversations, with regards to being able to cope, the level of denial for me stands out really in a big way. And I think the level of denial that we had really facilitated us to be able to even just move into the prison system or space every day. As Mario mentioned, you'd have to go through about 5 or 6 gates to actually get into the prison. And as much as that serves a function in keeping offenders inside, the reality is that if anything were to erupt, for one, we'd be greatly outnumbered, whether it be just in your section that you're working in, or whether it be when we ran our therapy groups, where it would be myself or Mariam alone with 20 to 30 to 40 offenders. And being locked behind 5 gates, as I said, it has its benefit in keeping everybody in, but the reality is that if anything were to go wrong, if anything kind of flipped in that moment, you would not be able to get out quick enough. So the denial of really the safety or how unsafe and the risk that walking in the prison entailed every day was I think ever present to us, and only in hindsight it's almost as one kind of recognizes that denial, but to a large extent I don't want to lean into it too much, because you kind of really then to a large extent realize the kind of risk that you were put into every day. So yeah, the denial. Splitting, I've come to realize, was another defense or maladaptive strategy I utilized, and I think Mariam did too. And what inevitably, interestingly happened was a splitting of good or bad between the wardens and the DCS staff, being seen as almost the perpetrators and the bad, while interestingly then the offenders almost being seen as the good, as the victims, not only victims within a system that treats them really harshly, but I think after we were sitting with many offenders, you almost realize that they had been victim to circumstance. And I think the splitting was necessary to a certain extent to almost allow you the ability to be able to even just sit with an offender in a room, because you need to believe that there is good as you're sitting across from someone behind the desk that really is speaking about, as Mariam said, really heinous crimes, really scary things even to consider. So there was definitely a splitting. I'll speak for myself. Despite the fact that there'd been 5 gates, I made sure that every opportunity that I did have, I would leave the prison and I would go and sit in my car. And as much as Mariam arrived late, I also admittedly would leave early. And I think that really kind of could be understood as my kind of attempts in these little ways, with a little bit of control that I had in terms of my movement, despite feeling quite stuck and locked in, was to avoid and to leave the prison space if and when I could, so that I could kind of get into the safety of and the quietness really of that was afforded to me when I was able to just sit in my car. And maybe also perhaps a reminder that, I mean, a car is all about movement. So a reminder for me that I could leave, as opposed to the offenders that we were seeing every day, who some of them would be on short sentences. But as Mariam said, we both saw those who had been sentenced to life, who had been there for years, or even the kind of the the door where they just kind of coming in, they leave, and before long they've kind of broken parole and they're back in. So the avoidance. I'll speak a little bit about the online shopping, because that for me has been quite an interesting thing for us to realize that was really a large part of what we utilized as a coping strategy. So the recognition of online shopping as a coping strategy came about when Mariam was talking to Leslie a little bit about her experiences with DCS, and she mentioned what she realized to have been an increase in her online shopping during her community service year. She then kind of chatted to some other colleagues, and then we quite, I don't know if it was shocking or amusing to realize that we'd all engaged in this behavior. And I mean, I think we all engage in online shopping, but it was interesting to kind of note the curve of kind of quite an increase or escalated online shopping during our community service year. So then what we did was we had a little focus group, myself, Mariam, Kriska, and Henri, who are all co-authors, and then obviously under the guidance of Leslie. We had a little focus group just to explore some of the common themes and maybe understand a little bit more about the motivations for this online shopping. And what emerged was that we all used online shopping as a way to cope with the anxiety of working within the prison system. And to some degree, I think the virtual world of the online shopping almost created a freedom and an openness, which was in vast contrast to the confines and the restrictions we had been experiencing on a daily basis. Further, upon kind of thinking about that, it became apparent that our online shopping was most likely motivated by our need to feel more power, to feel like things were more in our control, to feel free, to feel connected, especially for us who had to leave home and kind of work and live alone during our community service year. And this within a broader system or space that we really felt lonely, powerless, and restricted. So really online shopping created the space where we could feel more powerful, feel control, and feel free. I mean, it's interesting when we spoke about this and we all realized we shop for different things. If Mariam doesn't mind me using her example, is that what stands out in terms of what she bought during that year was mostly beauty products and really pretty things and things that smelled nice, fragrances, which was, I imagine, a way of kind of coping and defending against and really in contrast to the brown and orange, which stands out to me when I think about that time, and really that pungent smell. So being able to almost replace that with kind of this recognition that despite all of that, and I use the word kind of ugliness in inverted commas, one could kind of fill your space with beautiful, nice smelling things. I think further the online shopping allowed for an individuality to be acknowledged, and where we could also experience instant gratification, almost this need for rewarding ourselves for what was a really, really difficult year and what was really, really difficult and challenging work to do. So that was I think that the online shopping emerging as a coping mechanism or defense was it's been quite a pleasure to be able to kind of explore that further and further make sense of how it did fit into the broader experience of our time at DCS. Further defenses that we did also employ was displacement, and I think this was especially prominent when maybe sitting with a client who had committed or spoke about crimes where there was great violence, perhaps, and especially where there have been violence against women and children. And one almost needed to kind of compartmentalize that feelings to be able to then continue sitting and having some degree of empathy with those particular offenders. But then inevitably what happened perhaps is that there'd been a displacement of that irritability and anger maybe toward men in general. So that was definitely a feature and perhaps a way of coping and being able to continue being able to do one's work. And then the other was little tolerance for non-offenders. I think every day one became so aware of offenders who sought out therapy, and when starting to tell their stories, it became, I think, what was really eye-opening to me was the level of kind of how they'd almost really been victims to particular context and kind of traumas that I think was really difficult for me to hear. So one almost can't imagine what it might have been like for them to have experienced that firsthand. And one thing almost when you then kind of moving into our own spaces and kind of someone's complaining about Wi-Fi not working, or you don't have your favorite cereal here, what we like to term like first world problems, it almost felt like your response wants to be like there's worse things that could happen as opposed to the Wi-Fi not working. So almost like an irritability, but really little tolerance for non-offenders and what almost feels like insignificant problems. So, I mean, like I said, there are potentially much more ways of coping that we did utilize, but those are the ones that really stood out for us. Further ways of coping was really a colluding with the corrupt system. So within DCS, there is this requirement for monthly stats to be met. And monthly stats basically feeds into what is provided then to the ministers as evidence that these rehabilitation centers are working and in terms of rehabilitating these offenders. The problem with the targets that were set, though, is that you would only be able to, your first session with the client is the only number that counts. Any follow-ups do not count as session numbers. So, I mean, you have to then work the system as the clinical psychologist. So what we ended up doing was having these once-off groups, which really does not match up with how we've come to understand psychology to work, which is more process-orientated. So I definitely think to a large degree there was definitely a colluding with the system in terms of reaching those numbers where psychologically one can almost question or have real big doubts or even ethical questions around what was the meaning of those groups, and did they even, seeing a group of 40 once or for about 30 to 40 minutes, is that even making any change? Is that even me having any psychological input? But in hindsight, I think that was definitely one way of colluding with the corrupt system. And I think further onto that then, also the playing the who you know game. Things didn't necessarily work how they were supposed to. So much like offenders figure out who they can kind of target or use to be able to reach their aims or what they're hoping to achieve, so too did we. You kind of identify who the kind of powerful people are within the ranks of the wardens or so, and you make sure that you, in some cases, even bypass protocol and go straight to that person to work the system to your favor to some degree. And maybe that was because the system at times felt like it didn't necessarily work for us. I think maybe in some degree also it felt like the system worked against us. So one way of doing that was to collude with this corrupt system, bypass protocol, and just kind of playing that who you know game. And then lastly was the sneaking the phone in. And I think that as much as I want to argue that we weren't committing a crime, but we were definitely breaking the rules. And I think that when one thinks about the prison system, that the first thing kind of comes to mind is corruption and breaking of rules. And that's what we did. I mean, if I make sense of it, I think it was all about our need for connection, to feel connected to the outside world. But we did kind of break rules within a system that was corrupt. And through that, they really colluded and it almost became a little bit uncomfortably so, I'd say, part of the system that I like to, I tend to view quite negatively, I'll be honest.
I think that in order to understand what the experience was like, one has to be aware of the many safety issues working in the prison system. And like Megan said, that there was lots of denial on our part. And I think I really only realized this many years later when Leslie and I first spoke about my experience, that I was actually in denial the whole time. Because I remember when people often asked me, they heard that I was working at Paulsma, and, they were all in shock and flabbergasted about this, and I would always say, no, but I enjoy the work there. And after I completed my year, my husband said to me, every single day when you left, I would worry until you came back home. And I had no idea he felt that way until obviously after I completed my community service. But the reality was that the system, the prison was unsafe. We had a workshop prior to going into DCS that was offered to us by someone who had worked there before, and he explained, the system and explained the protocols. When you were seeing clients, that the warden would have to bring the offender to you, stay outside of your door until you were done, and then take him back to his cell and all of that. But none of that happened according to protocol in the prisons that we were working in. So where I was, offenders weren't cuffed. They moved around freely. I mean, often I had them come to my office. I remember there was one offender who I'd seen after he was actually brought to me because he had been involved in an attack on the wardens, and I had to do an assessment. And he ended up, agreeing to starting a process. And after about 4 sessions, when I had called for him, they said he had been moved. And so, I tried 2 more times, and they said no, he had been moved. And then when I actually came back from my maternity leave, he just appeared in my door one day. I was busy working. I think I was busy writing or making notes, and he appeared in the doorway, and he said, why didn't you call me again? And I explained that I had called him, and that they said that he had been transferred to another prison, but he just appeared in my door, and I had to get over the shock very quickly and just respond to him. But there was this movement of uncuffed offenders, and where my office was, the passage, it was right by the holding cells, which was often unlocked. And the entrance where offenders who were newly sentenced also came in right outside of our passage. So we were very close to the majority of movement of offenders. And many of the helpers that, people who worked in the prison were all offenders. My admin helper was also an offender. And in some ways, I felt comforted by the fact that I had an offender working with me, so he would often, take the names of the offenders who needed to come for the sessions for that day. Or when I had groups, he would accompany me, with the groups. So I felt strangely comforted by his presence, but at the same time, I was very aware that he was an offender as well. And if any of you have any knowledge about the prison system, you'll know that there's the number gangs that operate inside the prison as well. And because one day I mentioned to my admin person, I said to him, I sometimes worry going into the cells area, and he said, don't worry, we were instructed to make sure that you are always safe. So I didn't know if I should, feel comforted by that or worried about it, but it was a bit comforting knowing that he was always with me, and that I was never completely alone. Even the groups that we conducted that Megan mentioned, the bigger groups was conducted inside the cells area. And there was one particular incident where, so what I would do if I were going to run a group, I would send a notice in to say that I'm going to run a group. This is the title of the group, and anyone who's interested must give their names. And so I had about 25 or 30 people that wanted to attend the group. And then I had one warden who went in with me to help set things up, because we were going to screen a movie and do a discussion on anger management. And by the time, and they have to sign to say that they've attended the group, because it goes on their record as well. And then by the time I got back to the office and I had a look at the signatures, there were about 50 signatures. And I was very aware while I was conducting the group that as I was busy, offenders were walking in and out, just joining. And at one point, it was quite a big group that was there. And I tried not to think about the fact that I was one person with one warden, and there was about 30 to 40 offenders attending the group. So the safety and the risks were very, very real. Also, in the office, there was a very big panic button. And I remember on the first day, I asked the social worker, what happens when you push the button? And he says, well, nothing, because the button hasn't been working for the last couple of years. So, all of these things you try not to think about while you were working, because in the office that we worked, you were alone with the offender, and there was no warden outside of your door because they were understaffed. And although there was this glass window separating my office and the social worker's office right next door, I often thought about how long it would take for someone to actually notice if something were to happen, how long it would take them to notice and then come around to my office, But you try not to think about these things as you sat every day, with at least four to five offenders conducting sessions with them. So there was a panic button that didn't work. And even with wardens working inside the cells, there was no communication. There was no way of communicating when you were inside the cells area to the admin staff at the front or the guards in the front. because there was an incident also once where wardens were attacked and I had to debrief them, and that was one of the things that came up, that in that moment there were 4 wardens with doing a roll call with a cell of 40 offenders, and again being struck by the fact that they had no way of communicating that something was happening. You know, either it was one having to run away and go get help while the other 3 are left behind, but there was actually no way of communicating, and I think this was something that stood out, but at the same time you just suppressed it because you couldn't focus on that. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to go into that space every day, you know, working there, being alone with an offender in an office, and just every day hoping and praying that nothing will go wrong today. And one day in a management meeting, we spoke about this, and I said to the head of the center, you know, just because nothing has happened doesn't mean nothing can happen, and we should start thinking about putting processes in place that would keep, you know, the staff safe, because there's no because of the understaffing also of the wardens. There's no consideration for, you know, having a guard in the passage even, especially when offenders are coming for sessions with either myself as a psychologist or the social worker, because there was often movement in our passage. But yeah, I think that one has to understand what that environment was like and what you needed to hold in mind and suppress, and not think about in order to be able to go there every single day. So just to conclude our talk, Megan mentioned the first group of psychologists who were in DCS, and it was so interesting that I read that article by those group of psychologists, and it was the first thing that stood out for me was the fact that everything that they had experienced at that time, and 15 years later, I had experienced exactly the same thing. So that was something that really stood out for me, that, you know, nothing had changed over all of this time, nothing had changed. And we had to make use of these varying strategies, and of course, as you saw, they weren't always all healthy, but we had to make use of these strategies in order to be able to function in that space. And only when I had this first discussion with Leslie about my experience, and even in the process of writing that very first article, I realized that I actually spent my community service, you know, in denial about the safety and the risks of the space. But despite all of that, I found the work to be meaningful. The work that I did with especially with offenders who requested sessions, I found that work to be quite meaningful. And you know, but I was also left with worry when I concluded my year, because there were some cases who were, you know, that was incomplete, and there were offenders that I knew or I felt you know, that there were risks that they might reoffend, and I knew they were being released. So you're left with almost this incomplete process and, you know, uncertainty about how things were left. And that was something that stayed with me. You know, even now, still I think about it sometimes. And I think the other thing that stands out for me, and again we had a talk about this, was that we were able to sit with a population who committed such, you know, heinous crimes. And often I thought about, you know, is it just because I'm a clinical psychologist that I'm able to sit with this kind of person? What does it say about me being able to sit with a murderer and being able to be empathic in that moment and listen to his story and look past his crimes and look at the history and try to make sense of, you know, where he's at? What does it say about us being able to work in that space, you know? And I think this whole talk, even the articles that was written, we want to think about what kind of support can be provided to a novice psychologist who is going into a system really and being exposed to possibly the most difficult cases they will work on, you know, without any kind of support.
Thanks, Mariam. I mean, I think in conclusion, there's this definitely apparent theme as we speak about the DCS and almost this dismissive of psychology, and really an overwhelming, perhaps, lack of understanding from the system as to what psychology is and what psychology might offer. So, I mean, to come back to the question around, I mean, the reality is maybe to a large degree that nothing has changed unless something has changed in the last 5 or so years since our time there. But then is there really a place for psychology within DCS? And if so, what might that look like, or what needs to change or be put into place for there to be a better kind of fit or match with psychology and DCS? So, I mean, I jotted down a few ideas, and the one I think is as Mariam highlighted, the safety issues. I think is a foundation. It's important that the aspects regarding safety and the issues as she raised need to be in place before one can kind of do any kind of meaningful work, so that you can be fully present with their client without having the concern concern around your safety. So the kind of procedures that they supposedly propose that is necessary and part of the rules per se actually kind of is a reality. That for me is the first thing. The second thing is that perhaps in an ideal world, they should not rely on community service psychologists to be doing the risk assessments for the offenders being considered for parole. I think that it's a really overwhelming responsibility for really newly, not even qualified yet, but new psychologists to be able to carry that burden. And then within the setting of the fact that you, as a ComServe, you're only there for 1 year, which is a very short time. So maybe ideally the permanent psychologists need to be doing that so they can have a kind of more prolonged exposure to offenders to be able to give ethical and meaningful feedback within these parole reports. Perhaps if there is really no other way to go around it, then community service psychologists and even psychologists in general at DCS, which we feel was greatly lacking, was better training perhaps in risk assessments, because it really felt to a large degree like there'd been a mismatch between our training leading up to ComServe and then what was required for us within ComServe at DCS. So I think that if there can just be kind of more formal and comprehensive training, that might be helpful. DCF staff, perhaps to a large degree, need to be better educated or informed around what psychology is and how it works. And that will also help in terms of referrals, so that psychology moves away from being that wastebasket, as Mariam said, to really having referrals of clients and offenders who are needing the service. And then I think last and most importantly, however, is that DCS as a system, and especially with regards to the stats, seems to be very focused on outcomes. It's almost this outcomes-based emphasis on numbers. And the reality is that is almost at odds with how psychology works. Psychology is more process-orientated, and that's where the work happens. That's what's most important. So until, I guess, to some degree, there's an alignment of where the emphasis is, we might then still continue finding that things continue to be at odds until perhaps a shift and a recognition is reached around the importance of process above outcomes necessarily.
And that's our talk. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you for painting such a clear picture, such a vivid picture, and giving us this thick description of what it was like working in that system. I mean, at some points I could picture you guys in these situations. So thank you for that. I think this is very important work, and you probably want to engage with DCS and see how you can take this a bit further. Because like you say, it's been so long and nothing has really changed. So thank you for that. There are a few questions in the comments. So if you guys could give us just 10 minutes and answer some of those questions, that would be quite nice. Can you see the questions?
I'm checking now.
So the first one is from Leslie.
Okay, I'm just scrolling up quickly.
We don't have to deal with mine now, given time. You know, we can have a long talk about this later.
Okay, so and cookies later and a discussion with Leslie. Okay. Laura Hartman says,
interesting point, Leslie. We will definitely talk about that again.
Yeah, well, a fabulous presentation, but I've just got a whole other thing to discuss. It'll take too long though.
Okay, so the next comment is from Mr. Sobekwa, who says insightful and well presented. And then Laura asks, she says, what is your perception of how your clients viewed your sessions? Did you ever have conversations on the value they found in them? Or is there any literature that you know of that explores this?
I think there is some limited literature on that explores this, but definitely, like I said, with offenders who requested to see the psychologist, those were the most meaningful processes, and we were able to take those kind of processes to conclusion when we were leaving, and have reflection on the process. And for, I think, all of the clients that I worked with, you know, they all found it quite a useful space. What always struck me was that simple things, you know, they would tell us a story about their life, or we'd be talking about something that's happening, and you know, they would talk about something, and you'd ask them one question or just give one comment that would take it into a different perspective. And I was always struck by how simple that was, but that they'd never ever thought about it. So even that, I remember I was working with someone who ran a drug business, and he was now going to be released, and someone was going to get him a job to work like at a retail store or something like that. And he was, like, what must I do at the retail store and all of that? And I said, you know what, you ran a business, albeit a drug business, you ran a business. It takes a business savvy, and it takes lots of skill and knowledge to be able to do that. And perhaps you can apply that in this space. And this is a job, like an entry-level job, but no one says that you have to stay there forever. You could use this space to again build yourself up, but in a way that is more constructive, and that will contribute to our society and our economy rather than break it down. So I think for those processes, we always had positive feedback in terms of the space that we provided for those offenders. Sometimes when they were required to come, so if they were ordered to come through the parole board or through once they were sentenced from the court, often it would take a while for them to kind of see the value of the space. But even I've had processes even like that who eventually, where they found it quite useful, and they would attend regular therapy, weekly. They would come for the appointments. So yes, they definitely, there was conversations around that, and they definitely found value in them.
100%. I think what you're speaking about also is those that came out of their own. And I think that points to, therapy is a co-created space. And as much as it's kind of us arriving and being present, the offender or the client in that case also needs to arrive, and the work happens when both are actively wanting to be there. And I think for those offenders who, as you say, wanted to be there, I think it was a meaningful process for them, even as you say, in some of the things that we don't even realize, which tend to be almost small. You recognize that maybe throughout their lives, they've never actually had someone ask them something as simple as, how does that make you feel? And in that moment, what feels to us almost like a normal kind of question to ask is significantly mind-blowing and shifting for them. I also had conversations with my clients around what sessions were like.
It sounds
Thanks
like
for the question.
an intense process. And to me, it feels as though you guys identified more with your clients than you did with colleagues, right? And do you think that your clients picked up on this?
I didn't say it in the presentation, but it's a weird thing, because as much as you were part of the system, but we didn't wear uniform, but we were also not part of the offenders. So in prison, there's this thing, as Mariam said, there's the numbers gangs. Then you get those that are not part of the numbers gangs, and they are called the Franse. They like these in-between people. And I was thinking a lot about us even, and to what extent we might have also been kind of France in the system. This kind of, as much as you kind of, this between space of to a large degree, I think it's inevitable when you see the way that offenders are treated there, that you automatically almost want to side with what really feels within a system like they're the victims. And I think to a large degree they picked up on that.
They're very aware that you're not part of the system, but they're also aware that you're not part of their system. But they know that you are there to help them. So I think that although they pick up that you're not part of the broader system, they know that you are there to help them, and so they are much more cooperative with us than they are with the wardens. There was one offender that once asked me to bring something in, and he said to me, he was the same offender who said that the only difference between the offenders and the wardens is the color of the uniform. He always had these lines that he would drop. He said to me, he got his radio was confiscated because you're not allowed to share whatever you were given permission. You're not allowed to share with someone else, and he had shared it, and he got it confiscated. And then he said someone has a laptop. If I can please bring, like a little flash drive with some music on for him. I mean, this is simple as music, And he said, please, they'll never suspect you, because obviously I'm dressed like this. And I said, you obviously, we've been having a process, so you obviously know that I'm not going to do that. And he said, but why? They all, everyone outside does it. And I said, well, look at me and look at them. Do we look the same? He says, no, but that's besides the point. They won't suspect you. I really just need to listen to some music. You don't understand what it's like, being in that cell and not having anything, and so we had a good discussion about it. But they are aware that you're not part of the system, but at the same time I don't know, I think it's just how everything is set up, that although you knew, you still tried. You wanted to try because and I think that speaks to the need that he had at the time.
There's a question from Julia also. She's still online. So let's see if we can get this answered. How did you adjust after leaving DCS? And what helped you in the process of recovery from these traumatic experiences?
Didn't. Time. I don't know about Megan, but I in waiting to register as an independent practitioner with the HPCSA, which always delays, I had about 4 months that I was off, and obviously with a small baby. I think I was more distracted because I'd had my baby towards the end of my my time at DCS, so I had the baby to keep me distracted, and I think I really only started speaking about it when I spoke to Leslie about it, when I was telling him about my experiences. And I think in writing the article was probably the first time since the experience that I actually engaged with the experience. I didn't really think about it much. And then even after that was a period where I didn't speak about it again. And then until the online shopping thing came up, where one of my other colleagues spoke about how online shopping, she attended a talk where they were speaking about online shopping, becoming also an addictive process. And then I just, interestingly asked a few of my colleagues, because we were speaking about when we did online shopping, and I said, actually when I was in DCS was the time I really, and buying things that I didn't need. So that's when the whole conversation started. But between those times, I mean, I actually never really spoke about it. And I think the time, like I said, having the distraction, and then now obviously engaging with the content and really reflecting on the experience, that has helped.
I mean, I think it's difficult also to say, because I don't think it's necessarily the adjustment process is going to be a one-size-fits-all thing. I think what Mariam's speaking about, having the distraction of a young baby, I think to a large degree, my kind of coping mechanism was to come back to the familiar, come back to the comfort. So I came back to Stellenbosch. I'm still here now. But really with time, I think, we're 5 years post and only now really having conversations. I don't know if to what extent I would have been able to really engage deeply with kinds of conversations we're having now, maybe like straight after the process. I really can't say that. But I think, Julia, speaking about it, if I can just say my own experience, speaking about it and really having that felt sense where what I experienced is kind of shared and I recognize that I'm not alone has been really helpful.
For me, the same. I think what Megan mentioned at the beginning of the presentation about that shared experience, I think when you learn that, okay, I'm not the only one who had this experience. I'm not the only one who had these fears. I'm not the only one who struggled with this. I think that, because when you're in that year, you're so isolated from everyone. I suppose you're so busy that you're not actually talking about it at that time. Because my classmates, since our M1 year, we've been in contact, but here and there, they would be mentioned, but we never really had a full-on conversation about it, I think. And but getting to the point where you realize that you're not alone in what you experienced, I think that helped most, just knowing that it was a shared experience.
Thanks again. Thank you, Mariam and Megan. That was such a wonderful presentation. We hope that you'll present at the colloquium again soon. Thank you to everyone who joined today. We're going to upload this discussion to our YouTube channel, and you guys can watch it later, and also ask your friends to watch it. I think that is quite useful for any psychologist or any student in psychology or anyone training to be a psychologist to watch this. So thank you, everyone, and take care. See you at the next one. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.